Good morning to all. Welcome to Women's Empowerment in the Caribbean, Regional and Multi-Sectoral Perspectives. My name is Luis Guillermo Solis. I am the visiting professor and interim director of the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center here at FIU. We are very happy to host this webinar, which we organize in associations with the Caribbean Policy Consortium. And I will give the floor to my dear colleague, David Lewis, in a second to greet you on behalf of CPC. This is going to be one of a series of webinars that we carry, and we've been doing this since last year with CPC on the situation of the Caribbean agenda in general. We have been dealing with security, economic, social, cultural issues for a while, and on this occasion, women leaders will discuss the opportunities associated with female empowerment in the Caribbean and also with political leadership and some of the most pressing issues for women in this important area of our hemisphere. Some of the questions that we would like to pose is how are women engaged in their different economic activities? How can they be further engaged in others? And what are some of the challenges they face? But also, we want to highlight the contributions of women in Caribbean politics and in other areas, and we're very grateful that our panelists will be addressing those issues. Before presenting our moderator, I would like to give the floor to David Lewis. Dr. Lewis is the president of the Caribbean Policy Consortium, who with LACC organizes this series of events. Dr. Lewis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luis. President Solis. Good morning to everybody. Ladies on the panel, thank you for joining us today, and people virtually with us in the US, Caribbean, and internationally. The Caribbean Policy Consortium was launched last year to promote policy and research discussions on the Caribbean between a group of US-based and Caribbean-based scholars, practitioners, policy people. And last year, we were able to start a program with FIU, which has been very successful. And as President Solis mentioned, this year we're in round 2. And in addition to this program, we'll be having programs on the economic recovery on the Caribbean during the pandemic, as well as programs on US-Caribbean relations under the Biden administration, and a program on business-to-business initiatives between the Caribbean and the US over the next few months. So you can sign up and receive the notices, and we look forward to your participation. I'm personally pleased that we were able to put this one today together. And I'd like to say we planned it perfectly, but that would not be true. The fact that just yesterday, Prime Minister Mia Mottley in Barbados won her re-election, first one under the new republic status of Barbados. And I think that's, I won't say any more on that. There's just a whole bunch of political and empowerment issues there that have to do with not just Barbados, but the region as a whole. So that's very important. And then secondly, for my almost second adopted home, Jamaica, when I went to school there almost 40 years ago, I was very pleased as we started this to read a quote from a colleague businesswoman of Miss McIntosh Robinson in Jamaica, who is always fond of saying in her presentations, women run Jamaica's economy. And that was one of the key issues I thought we should make sure that we have a woman business person from Jamaica being able to explain to us what really is happening in the business scene in Jamaica and maybe the rest of the Caribbean with regards to that participation. So with those 2 points, President, thank you so much. Ladies, thank you for your participation. And we look forward to an excellent session.
Well, thank you very much, David. And as soon as we're talking of Jamaica, let me say that my grandmother and my great-grandmother came to Costa Rica from Jamaica. So I'm also a proud Jamaican myself, although I don't have the dreads anymore. But I'm very happy to know that we are all in many ways associated with the Caribbean today. We are very proud and also very thankful to have Kimberly Green, Dr. Kimberly Green, as our moderator, our active moderator today, because she's also going to participate as any other panelist in this event. As you know, we proudly bear the name of Dr. Green in our center. She's the center's benefactor, but she's also an accomplished philanthropist, writer, and documentary filmmaker. She has led the Green Family Foundation since 1997. Under her leadership, the foundation has spearheaded a variety of initiatives that have been immeasurably impacted the lives of thousands of people across the world and in her local Miami. In Haiti, Ms. Green and GFS work ranges from community health and development to cultural preservation. Ms. Green, who directed and produced the award-winning documentary Once There Was a Country, Revisiting Haiti, narrated by the late Dr. Maya Angelou and Guy Johnson, also oversaw the Cultural Committee for the Clinton Global Initiative Haiti Action Network. In Miami, Dr. Green and the foundation she presides over has a number of initiatives, among them a photographic history of Black Miami, Haiti, and Island Luminous, an online resource dedicated to Haitian history and Haitian studies in partnership with the Digital Library of Congress. And most recently, the Green Space Miami, which is the foundation's new community art space located in Biscayne Boulevard, historic district of Miami. Ms. Green, furthermore, has close associations with Florida International University, and this has resulted in the creation of our library, the Stephen and Dorothea Green Library, as well as the Neighborhood Health Education Learning Program, where students at the Wortham College of Medicine work with medically undeserved families throughout Miami-Dade County. So here we have a very committed and an engaged person, Caribbean affairs, also a woman of enterprise, of ideas, and of imagination. So Dr. Green, thank you so much. Kimberly, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. That was a very long introduction. So first I want to say thank you to Dr. Lewis and Dr. Zwengel and Mrs. McIntosh Robinson, and of course, President Solis. I just want to say that the reason why the introduction is so long is it's not necessarily all of my work that was described here. It is the foundation's work and the team at the foundation and our partners. We have some wonderful partners in Miami and in the Caribbean. So we've been able to sort of spread our wings over this whole area. And we are just as strong as our partners next to us. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. Also, thank you to CPC. This is a really exciting partnership. I'm excited about seeing how we move forward with the with FIU and all that you're doing in the Caribbean and in the region. So it's very exciting. So I'm going to introduce our two esteemed guests today, our panelists. You'll have to excuse me, I am reading because I have a hard time memorizing everything. There's so much going on Zooms lately. So first of all, thank you, Professor Dr. Zwengel. Dr. Zwengel is Associate Professor of the Department of Politics and International Relations at Florida University. Her research interests are women's human rights and their translation, women's movement and public gender policies around the world, global governance and gender, and feminist and post-colonial IR theories. She is author of Translating International Women's Rights, the CEDAW Convention in Context, Palgrave Macmillan, 2016, and co-editor of Feminist Strategies in International Governance with Elizabeth Prugel and Goulet Kaglar, Routledge, 2013. Her work has appeared in a number of edited volumes, as well as a wide range of academic journals. She currently works on Caribbean engagements with global gender equality frameworks. Thank you so much, and welcome to Dr. Zwengel. And hello, we have Mrs. McIntosh Robinson, which we're very excited to see, and thank you. So Mariame McIntosh Robinson is a global financial services leader with 20 plus years experience as a P&L leader, investor, board member, and advisor to the leading companies in the US and the Caribbean. Currently, McIntosh Robinson is the president and chief executive officer of Full Global Bank Limited, a commercial bank operating in Jamaica that offers a comprehensive suite of banking products and services. She joined as president and CEO in 2016 to lead the bank's transformation and strategic pursuit of financial inclusion. And during this time, she and her team have transformed the organization's culture, more than doubled profit, tripled the bank's retail network, primarily by adding bank agents, and assumed a market-leading role in serving unbanked individuals and small and medium enterprise. Prior to joining First Global Bank Limited, McIntosh Robinson was a partner at Portland Private Equity, the largest private equity fund manager in the Caribbean, with with 425 million in AUM across 2 successor funds. In the earlier part of her career, McIntosh Robinson spent nearly 9 years at Bain & Company and McKinsey & Company, where she advised CEOs and senior leadership teams of Fortune 500 companies on growth strategy and implementation. McIntosh Robinson currently serves as director on several private and public boards in Jamaica and Barbados, and is a trustee of the United Way Worldwide Board. She is vice president of the Private Sector Organization of Jamaica, PSOJ, and the board chair of Teach Caribbean, an educational NGO she co-founded in 2006 with seed funding from Rhodes Trust to provide access to quality education for economically disadvantaged youth. She is also a member of the Jamaica chapters of the International Women's Forum and Young Presidents Organization, and was named Young Global Leader with the World Economic Forum in 2014. McIntosh Robinson is a graduate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology with a Bachelor of Science degree in electrical engineering and a minor in economics. She also has an MBA from Harvard Business School, where she was the co-recipient of the Dean's Award for Outstanding Leadership on Campus, and as an MPhil in economics from Oxford University, where she was a Rhodes Scholar. She is married and has 2 children. Thank you to both of you for being here. This is very exciting. What an interesting and sort of diverse and across all boards panelists we have today. So I think for me, it's very interesting hearing both of your backgrounds, because we're dealing with 2 very powerful humans that happen to be women that are both on an academic level and a practical level, working both with people in the communities and also addressing sort of systemic and structural inequalities for women and gender biases. So I think today would be interesting to talk a little bit about the difference between sort of the institutionalized commitments that organizations make to women and gender equity across the board. We have a lot of commitments from CARICOM and from the UN and Millennial Development Goals, which have now been switched since we're 22 years past the millennium. And it's interesting how we have people sign, countries and organizations sign on, but what is actually implemented on the ground, and how do global affairs and environmental issues affect these commitments and the execution of them. So I'm just gonna, I have a few questions that were sort of handed to me, which I think are really interesting. So I'd like to open, if that's okay, with, so it is crucial to ensure that women in the Caribbean, as it is the case in the world over, are incorporated in the productive sectors in fair and secure conditions. The International Labor Organization refers to these labor activities as decent jobs, which entail, among other factors, equal pay for equal responsibilities vis-a-vis their male counterparts, even though women are still paid 25% less for equal jobs. What are some of the most crucial elements necessary to achieve this goal? I'm going to mute myself, and I'm going to leave the floor open for either Dr. Svengel or Ms. McIntosh Robinson to address anything that I.
Thank you very much. I thought I was told that I should go first, because I think Mrs. McIntosh Robinson, she has so much more sort of current and hands-on knowledge, apart from all the academic credentials, of course, that we have heard. And I have maybe a little bit more of an institutional, global, historical background, which I thought I'd maybe better share first, if that's okay. Let me share my screen with you. I brought a little presentation. Okay, I hope you can see this. And so first and foremost, thank you again for inviting me. I feel very honored to be here. I would say I'm sort of a learning expert when it comes to the Caribbean. As you have heard from the kind introduction, my expertise is a lot in global gender equality norms and women's rights norms. And I got very interested in Caribbean feminism through that global perspective, as you will see. And the two women that I'm sharing here with you on the screen are on the left, Peggy Anthropos, and on the left, Lucille Matherin-Mayer, who I think can aptly described as Caribbean feminist trailblazers, both globally and in regional perspective. And I think there's a lot to learn from them. So this goes back a little bit, but I think it also, helps us to think about what empowerment of women means today, or could mean today. Okay, now I can move this. Oh, here we go. Okay. So as I said, my expertise comes from the global level. And I think what I've learned and what my research and other people's research has found is, if you think about awareness regarding gender equality, global frameworks regarding gender equality, they can be described as a qualified success story, right? I mean, you have it came, if you think about the United Nations, founded in 1945, this came in maybe a little late, but starting with the 1970s, we had the World Women's Conferences. They started in 1975. The last one is in 1995. So that's a time of a lot of awareness raising of women's issues and concerns. We have the Women's Rights Convention that was mentioned in the introduction, CEDAW, which stands for the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination of all forms all forms of discrimination against women. I'm sorry, it's a very long acronym. And we have other things like the creation of UN Women. We have a huge effort to create gender-sensitive data, so that which wasn't there necessarily before. So we have a lot of achievements, but as was also mentioned, it's a qualified success story because we have very limited follow-through by many states. And of course, we have within this multilateral context that the UN presents itself to be, we have persisting geopolitical hierarchies, which means that some interests are more important than others. And for women from the global south, this has been maybe a space where not all the things that they wanted to achieve could have been achieved. Peggy Anthropos, one of the ladies that I showed you a picture of before, she actually is part of this global women's movement. And she has written a very interesting book in 2004, which basically encapsulates also this argument that I'm trying to make here. There's a lot that has been achieved in this collective thinking and activism of women coming together from many different parts of the world. But there's also a lot of limits. And from her perspective, the limits are in particular an unchanged economic structure that is beneficial for some and very, very detrimental for many, many others, particularly in the global south. Now, from this global level work that I have done quite a bit, I have now actually moved into a project that connects the Caribbean with the global framework, and I call this Norms for Whom? Caribbean Engagements with Global Gender Equality Frameworks. And I'm basically interested in three questions. One is to find out about Caribbean feminisms. What are the important ideas? What are the strategies? Who are the people? What are the achievements? Then the way Caribbean feminists have contributed to this global level framework, right? As I have already hinted at that, I know that there is very significant Caribbean engagement and influence in those frameworks. And then the third question would be how domestically and public gender policies within the Caribbean, how those frameworks are useful or maybe not so useful, maybe they are not as fitting as we want them to be. That's something I would like to find out. And I'm very happy to share that I got a Fulbright fellowship awarded for this. And I'm actually currently joining you from Trinidad and Tobago, where I'm going to be located for a little while from now on. And I'm super happy about this because this was very difficult during, is actually still a little difficult through COVID times, but now it has happened, which I'm, again, very, very happy about. Okay, so coming from the global level, I just also wanted to share a little bit of, the background of the Caribbean post-colonial states out of which this feminism, Caribbean feminism that I'm looking at here has developed. And I know that for many of you, this is, old knowledge, but I'm thinking that perhaps there are people for whom this is new. So I just say a few words quickly. So there's this long experience of colonial exploitation that the Caribbean and the Anglo-Caribbean in particular has been exposed to. And then we have in the 1960s, 70s, this new phase of a reinvention, right, of a self-determined post-colonial state, which really is all about, finally creating a public project that's for the people that live in the state, in Jamaica or Trinidad, Tobago, and other states, Barbados, and not anymore in the interests of people elsewhere who extract all the economic resources from those countries, right? Of course, the economic constraints remain pretty much the same, but in a way, considering the situation of the countries, most of them actually try to follow a path of modernization and making it under those constraints, basically, right? And so the idea is to really create a public project for everybody. And I think under the conditions, many of those state projects have been very successful, in terms of sharing, for example, providing opportunities for public education, including higher education, accessible for everybody, healthcare, job creation, industry creation and diversification of the economy to create jobs for people and so forth, right? Now, Eugene Baritow, who's also a very famous Caribbean feminist, she wrote this book in 2001 called The Political Economy of Gender in the 20th Century Caribbean. And she looks at this development state, this Caribbean development state, and basically argues that it's a gendered project, right? So it is really a project in which women benefit also materially with, job openings, openings to higher education, healthcare, social services, and so forth. But nevertheless, and women's work is also needed for this project, right? But nevertheless, women are integrated in a kind of subordinate position where the assumption somehow is that they take care of the unpaid reproductive labor. So that's sort of a more implicit, but it's a very important role for the development state, family and biological reproduction, but that's somehow implicit and not explicit. So there's a gender dimension to this project, but the point is to move societies forward and make them more self-determined in a way, right? Now, Lucille Mayer and Peggy Antrobus, they are really part of this development state project. And both of them have mostly contributed to this within Jamaica, even also partly to other countries in the Caribbean. So they are being socialized in this time. They are actually, very highly educated. They were part of the political elite, and they sort of helped build their respective Caribbean state, right? And it's in this context that they start to think in gendered terms. And it's interesting to me because both of them, by now, I would say they are so, famous feminists. They both say at some point they were not feminists. I mean, they sort of got this knowledge in a way. They gathered this knowledge on the way. So this came to them step by step in that way. And it's maybe not surprising because this development state at its outset didn't think much about gender. I mean, you see also Eugene Baritow's book is of 2001. At the time, 1960s, 70s, gender wasn't important. What was really important was like race relations and economic positionalities of Caribbean states in a way, right? Now, I just want to walk you through what I see as a feminist awareness raising process, and also one out of which results some interventions like in 3 steps. So the first is, and I find this really quite fascinating, really the invention of women-focused historiography in the Caribbean. And that can be attributed to Lucille Mayer, who wrote in 1974 a dissertation, which that you see the title here, A Historical Study of Women in Jamaica, 1655 to 1844. That's during slavery and shortly after. you also see that as a book, this was actually published by other people and much, much later, but she writes this in 1974. And it's really the very first monograph on women in the Caribbean ever written. The first thing that exclusively focuses on women in the Caribbean. So she's a real door opener to think about Caribbean history from a women's perspective. And she does that embedded in the scholarship that is being undertaken at the time, which is, as I said, very strongly focused on race relations, on unpacking this long, long history of racial divisions and exploitation and hierarchies that came with colonialism and slavery and indentureship and so forth, right? So basically she contributes to the scholarship, but she adds for the very first time a focus on women. And in a nutshell, what she writes in what her findings in the book are, quote, the white woman consumed, the colored woman served, and the black woman labored. So you can see very much how gender relations, are embedded in race relations. So you cannot really sort of pull those apart. So in a way, therefore, you also have feminist thinking in the Caribbean is never only about gender. It's always connected to race and ethnic collectives in a way, right? And also what you can see also is, of course, that apart from a very small white female elite, women were laboring and working, and oftentimes without pay, and certainly in a situation that's very much the opposite of decent work that was mentioned before, right? And women have always been in employment in the Caribbean. And I mean, you can also see again, so from a Caribbean perspective, you think of women not as one collective, as sort of, a solidarity or something. Gender is something very, very much connected to racial hierarchy. I just also pointed out here another book written by Rhoda Reddock, much later, 20 years later, on women, labor, and politics in Trinidad and Tobago, a history, which is, writes a similar history for Trinidad and Tobago. And again, this was something to think about women in this context of the post-colonial state, was something that really started in the 1970s. So this was the first time that people started to think about that. So, and we have to have this knowledge to actually move further, right? And so the other two steps I just wanted to quickly talk to you about, which they come back to the global regional connection, right? So the second step here is domestic and international political intervention. So Lucille Mayer, she's a historian and writes this dissertation, but she then also becomes a public servant. She joins the Manley government in Jamaica at the time. And because of her dissertation, the government actually starts to think that it's necessary to have something like a women's bureau. And that is in 1974 or 5, and that's really one of the very first women's bureaus in the entire world, not only in the Caribbean, but in the world. So they were very sort of, ahead of their time in a way. Peggy Antrobus becomes the first director of this women's bureau. Again, at the time, she says she's actually not really a feminist, but she sort of learned from the women that were around her in a way. And so both of them, in a way, they, shape their own understanding of gender issues and the position of women in Caribbean societies, and create public policies for women. And then also they represent Jamaica internationally. They go to the first World Women's Conference in Mexico in 1975, where they really, this is a conference which is a huge event where women for the very first time come together from all kinds of the world, all countries of the world. And that's where they get in touch with a lot of other feminists. Remember, this is before internet and so forth, from countries from the global south, where they find similar situations and where they sort of exchange experiences and basically form their position as global south feminists and what it is that women in poor countries need the most. That's very, very formative for both of them. And actually, Lucille Mayer becomes president of the next World Women's Conference in Copenhagen in 1980. It's an honor for her to be picked to do that. But this conference is actually one that is described as the most divisive ones among the World Women's Conferences. There's big disagreements between, on the one hand, women from socialist countries and the global south. At the time, that would have been called the third world and the second world, right? And women from the West, which was at the time called the first world, so they had sort of different viewpoints the Global South women were very strong about, rectifying economic exploitation and capitalist structures that were so detrimental to women in the Global South. They were experiencing structural adjustment programs that really, really made life very hard and very difficult for them. And the Western women, on the other hand, they were saying, well, you are sort of, instrumentalizing this women's conference. Let's talk about real women's issues, right? Like domestic violence, for example, or things that are exclusively female. And the women from the Global South were saying, well, economic exploitation affects women and many women, so we have to talk about it. So that was very divisive and a difficult conference. And I guess Mayor comes home from this conference a little bit disillusioned, and Anthropos also. And they keep thinking, right? And they figure out that you have to think a little bit more long term in terms of both organizing and knowledge creation. And so the two things that they do, which I find really interesting. Now there's other women involved also, but I sort of focus on these two figures for this particular talk right now. But one thing that they do is they say we have to create knowledge about women, about gender relations regionally, about women in the region that comes out of the region. Okay, we cannot allow women from the United States or from Europe to come up with sort of theoretical models and then apply that to our societies, because they really don't get it. They misunderstand what's going on. So we have to do this ourselves. So we have to actually have a gender studies institute as part of higher education. And they work very hard to get that done. It's very interesting at the University of the West Indies. And I'm very proud to say that I'm currently affiliated with the Institute for Gender and Development Studies at the UWI, which is that same institute. It has changed its name over time a little bit. But that's very important, this knowledge creation. And so for the students here and for the academics, never underestimate knowledge creation. Very, very important for empowerment. And the other thing is that they also engaged in movement building. So this is more than what Peggy Anthropos did. She became part of the very first feminist Global South network. Before there were feminist networks that were, coming out of the Global North. This one actually restricted membership to women exclusively from the Global South. So there were women from India, women from the Caribbean, from Latin America, from Africa, who came together in this network and try to, again, spell out structures of exploitation that women were particularly affected by, and that were obstacles for decent life and for their development. DAWN, which stands for Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, was founded after the Copenhagen conference, also because of this discontent there. Very, very famous network, which still exists, still going strong for a very long time under Caribbean leadership. So Peggy Anthropos actually was the director of that network for a time. And again, I'm focusing, and I'm also actually ending here on with DAWN. But what is so important about DAWN is it was the first organization that internationally talked about women's empowerment. And their most important focus was to identify what the root causes globally are of poverty and of marginalization. Okay, so that was very economically driven. There were a lot of criticism of exploitative capitalism that came out of this network. And their idea of empowerment was always empowerment for women as a collective. They didn't think of empowering women individually, right? They thought, okay, women are strong. Women are not victims or passive or anything. They are strong, but they live under conditions where they are disempowered. And we have to find out what that is, what the root causes for this disempowerment is. And we have to sort of push that aside. And for that, we need to allow women to organize collectively to do that together. And that's what I have for you. Maybe I was a little long, sorry for that, but thank you very much for your attention.
No, thank you. That was really incredible. It's so interesting to hear about how the evolution of women's rights and inclusion. I heard someone say the other day that progress is evolutionary, not revolutionary. And I think you can really see that in how you detailed the history of women's involvement in all these aspects of government and culture. The other thing that I really found interesting about that is that women are not a monolith, and the class issues within women's rights who is invited to the table? Are laborers invited to the table? Are the servers invited because they're serving, or are the consumers? And I found that really striking, and I'd love to hear more about that. I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping here. So I want to make sure that people know that they can submit their questions in the Q&A. There's a button on the lower part of your screen. Mine happens to be on the upper part, but for anyone. And I also wanted to give a shout out from Jennifer Nugent Hill of Tropical Shipping in Florida/Jamaica. I wanted to extend a greeting to all the members of Women in Maritime Association of the Caribbean, including their new president, Ms. Tamara Lowe of Dominica, who is attending today's webinar. Thank you. So I wanted to now introduce, which I already introduced, but open the floor for Ms. McIntosh Robinson to talk, to give her introduction of her work. And then we can open the floor to questions for Ms. Svengel and Ms. McIntosh Robinson.
Thanks so much, Ms. Green, and thank you, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. I think I just tried to do it. Let me not open it properly. So let me just try again. Can you see my screen properly now? Does it work? Yes, okay, all right. So again, good morning, everyone. And Ms. Green, thank you for posing those questions. I just want to say it's really a pleasure to be here. President Solis, former president of Costa Rica, current LACC interim director, Dr. David Lewis, co-chair of the Caribbean Policy Consortium, Madam Moderator and benefactor, Ms. Kimberly Green, president of the Green Family Foundation, fellow panelists, Dr. Zwingle, associate professor of politics and international relations and LACC affiliated faculty from FIU, specially invited guests, webinar participants, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It really is a pleasure to be here. Just picking up off of what Ms. Green said and Dr. Zwingle's presentation, I wanted to just share some opening comments for 10 minutes, specifically around women's empowerment. I'm coming from the point of view of the private sector and just a mixture of both personal experiences and what I've observed over the years, watching other leaders and managers, if you will. So there are two things I wanted to share. Number one is that, before I jump into my presentation, number one is that the world is evolving significantly. I mean, a lot of change is happening and it almost feels as if change is accelerating and models of leadership are expanding. So many decades ago, when you think about who would lead a certain type of organization, the perception of what that person would look like in terms of their background, in terms of how they visually appear, would be pretty narrow. And you would have decades and decades of a very specific type of leader, education, background, experience, etc. And what we're finding and what we've experienced is that those models and pathways to leadership is changing. And I've coined a term, what I call the unexpected leader, people who are in roles that probably 40 years ago, 30 years ago, they would never be in such a role. And I myself find myself quite grateful to many of the women leaders and specifically who have come before me, because I'm well aware that 50 years ago, perhaps I would not be the CEO of a bank. And so that is a very powerful thing around leadership and women. And so I do want to comment on that today and the benefit of this varying models of leadership, not just on the gender dimension, but the more we expand how it leads to better decision-making and more broadly, just better compliance and risk management, etc. That was point number one. And then theme number two that I wanted to just mention is that as our economies, particularly emerging markets economies in the Caribbean, are one of the biggest drivers of growth in any economy, Jamaica and other countries in the region no different, is the growth of our SMEs. The growth of our SMEs. And one of the biggest challenges that SMEs have is access to capital. So a lot of the work that we do at First Global Bank as part of the Grace Kennedy Group, I always tell persons I get excited about banking, which people find funny and weird, but it's because it's not just about doing well, but it's about the doing good aspect of it. And access to capital is a real pain point. And women, as I speak about women leading more businesses, being heads of households, the economic prosperity of women and their ability to overcome that challenge as all entrepreneurs face is also a key theme that I wanted to reflect on today. So as we think about what the current state is, this is fairly well known, but I wanted to just pull out a few things that jumped out for me. There are in the private sector, women well represented in middle management. And you would say, well, if that's the case, then there should be a pipeline that's pushing them through to senior leadership roles, board roles, which is really when you're really at the top of the house from a governance standpoint. And fun fact, Jamaica is number 15 on the global list. I know we've been sharing this for year after year. 59% of leaders roughly in Jamaica, call it 60%, are in middle management versus say 43% in the United States. But what we're seeing is that when you look at the very top of the house, we're not seeing that translate through, even as you think about the generational, because I mean, it will take time, but even as you think about generational movements of how long it takes to get to a firm, we're not seeing that conversion as quickly, but it has improved. The second thing I always find very fascinating is roughly in our population, there's a 50-50, male-female split, right? I don't know of any countries that are mostly female or mostly male. But when you think about representation in terms of policy and even more formally representational politics itself, again, you're seeing a much smaller representation of women, though it is growing. And in Jamaica now, and when you think of the member of parliaments, about 18 are women. That's a 30% representation, which is fantastic. But again, when you think about who their constituents are, you really would prefer to see more of a matching. And I know we talk about some of the reasons why that doesn't happen, but I think it's important, and I think the world is moving towards that. Access to capital, as I mentioned before, is a challenge for all entrepreneurs and female entrepreneurs. And COVID-19, which is an unprecedented crisis that we're facing in our lifetime, and certainly has been the first of this century, has really created a number of setbacks for certain areas. It's created lots of opportunities, but it's also created setbacks for certain areas, groupings of the population, children. One of my passions around youth and education, but we're talking about women today, but also women, because women have had to really juggle home and work and that balance. And there are a number of examples where people have taken a lower role or come out of the workforce if they can afford to do that, because their families are always, men and women, we hope our families are always going to be prioritized. And then finally, what I find as an interesting phenomenon is when you look at the tertiary institutions across the region, the majority of the enrollment is women. It would be interesting to see if that's the case in Florida, FIU, but that's what we're finding in the region. And in fact, when we think about education, what we need to be really focused on is how does our system focus on more effective ways to teach and engage our men, our boys who are going to grow up to be men. And so it's hard to have the conversation about women issues and not talk about this gap, which is a glaring gap in the region, because it has implications for when boys grow up to be men and how we interact with women and men, et cetera, et cetera. So that's my two areas today I've focused on, is really access to capital and leadership. So I'll go very quickly. I'm just going to comment on access to capital, and then I'm going to comment on leadership. On access to capital, what I've always said to persons, whether you're a very small business to a large company seeking capital, is that there's no reason why you should be told no. I know it sounds really silly, almost sounds a bit theoretical, but if you know the sources of capital that match up to your mandate that you require, and you know the process and what they're looking for, you should get to a yes. It's not subjective. It's not that subjective. And it's, once you're empowered with the information and knowledge, it's just about going through the process. 10 years ago, when I joined the private equity industry and the investing industry in the region, there were very few sources of capital. People who wanted equity capital, I'm speaking about equity now because there's more of a dearth of equity capital than debt capital. Banks have been in the region for over a century, at least over 100 years in some instances. And so people are very familiar with debt capital. But you'd have to know someone who is a high net worth individual to kind of get your business off the ground, or very generous families and friends and family. So friends and family still exist. High net worth individuals still exist. So those are always sources of capital. But in Jamaica and in Barbados and the Dominican Republic, I believe, and probably other countries in the region, the angel investment network has taken hold. These are investors who are willing to invest in early stage businesses or smaller businesses in terms of their life cycle, and take that risk to help the business to get to the next stage. And these are organized groups of high net worth individuals at times and other. Venture capital and private equity firms have also proliferated. There are many that's focused on the region. Again, when I started investing, we had to make the market. Now we see a number of firms. Some are sector focused, country focused, even style of investing focused. But again, this is a real benefit or boom versus a decade ago. The stock exchange, certainly that's also a source of capital for companies that are at a particular stage of maturity and looking to get more capital. Again, understanding the benefits. It's patient capital, but it is expensive, more expensive than that. Now, in terms of preparing, I always say prepare to secure the capital, because you should not get a no. I always say to people, you should get to the yes, and if you get the no, you should know why you'll have a no almost before you go into the process. Each potential capital provider has a mandate. So seek the one that matches your firm, your need, if you will. Capital providers also like to see skin in the game. So if you go to an individual, you go to a bank, you go to a fund, whoever it might be, and you say, I'd like to fund purchasing the next washing machine because I have a laundromat or a laundry business, they need to know how much of your money or your equity you're putting into this. And the reason why skin in the game is so important for capital providers is that you know your business best and they're taking the risk to come along with you, but they won't know it as well. And if things don't go well, they lose their shirts, the entrepreneur or business person moves on to the next thing. When you have skin in the game, you're more aligned and success is more likely. Have a compelling, clear plan. I always share this because most persons will say, I need to get somebody to write my business plan. Sometimes people even ask me. And I say, no. The best people to write your business plan is you. And start with the cash flows. You don't have to be a finance person. You know your expenses, that's cash outflows. And then you can make assumptions about your income, revenue, which is cash inflows. And you start from that, and then you build out your plan. What's your source of differentiation? Who is your team? How do you describe your operating model in a few paragraphs? What does the competitive landscape look like? What are financial projections? What are the biggest risks to your business, and how are you going to mitigate those risks? Those are the elements of a plan. And once it's compelling in particular, what's the pain point you're addressing and how are you differentiated to address that pain point? You're well off to the races. The information requirements are important for banks, for equity funds. They're very clear about what they want. And I always say to everyone, you should be calling your banker once a month, whether you need capital or not. Everyone has the right to pick up the phone and have a personal banker or a business banker, and you're just checking in. How's the market going? I don't have any needs, but how are you doing? So that when you finally do need capital, whether it's to buy a car or to start your business or take it to the next level, you already have a relationship with banks. I work at a bank. I know this is what the banks like and are pushing for. So it's well within your purview to develop a relationship with a banker. You're not wasting their time, even if you don't want capital at that time. Determine the terms and the valuation. These are the two biggest things when you want capital, and particularly on the equity side. What are the terms? How much are you willing to give up? If you're going to take in equity capital, you're probably going to give up a board seat. That's fine. If you have a small business, you may not even have a board. Maybe your investor says you should put a board together. That's fine. I know in the Caribbean, we're very, very worried about people talking our business. So we're not willing to get people to come in and be independent directors if you're a family business or if you've just started your own thing. But guess what? If they're a capital provider, you're pretty aligned. They're looking for you to be successful because when you're successful, they are successful. And this is the model anyway. This is the governance model. Get as many people to formally assist you where they're aligned with you, because it can only make your business get to the next level if you choose the right people. And then valuation is always, a discussion point. What is my business worth? How much am I willing to give up? And there are frames of references and approaches to this. but it's something for you, the person, the entrepreneur, the woman who's running your business. You have a hairdressing parlor, your business is worth something. So thinking through what that valuation is, and then having a negotiation, sometimes a negotiation is okay, standard, and that's fine. The final thing I'll say is just agree on whatever that reporting or governance is. If it's a bank, the bank is very clear about what they will need on an ongoing, usually an annual at least, basis. And for the governance piece, again, it's very important to figure out who's your board, who are your senior leadership, senior management folks around you. If you have a hairdressing parlor, who's your number two? When you're out, if you're sick or you have to look after children, who do you rely on? Or do you close down the business? What's your BCP, your business continuity plan? That's all wrapped into governance. So I'll just pause there, but I enjoy talking about access to capital because a lot of people come to me over the years, and when we talk, I'm big on demystifying it because we should be able to secure capital as entrepreneurs and certainly as female entrepreneurs. Permit me to just talk a little bit about leadership. I think there are significant, tangible, not just theoretically sound nice, significant, tangible benefits from having diverse leaders around the table. Now, diversity is certainly gender matters in the Caribbean. I've worked in the United States and I've worked in the Caribbean. Gender to me comes even more to the table, to the forefront in the Caribbean. But also people of different personalities, people of different training, people of different levels. I mean, truly a diverse leadership around the table makes for better decision making, but it also makes for when there is a problem that's going to happen. If all similar people are around the table and let's say there's fraud or something that's brewing, some people may not want to ask and embarrass others around the table. But if you have that diversity around the table, someone is probably going to be more likely to raise the question in that type of an environment. That's the tangible benefit of diverse leadership. And in the Caribbean, a big part of diverse leadership is women, having women and men, gender diversity. Let me just talk a couple of quick points that have really resonated throughout the years for me and what I've seen in the private sector. I think, when I was in the United States working, and I did well in that environment, one of the things that persons used to always say, she's so coachable. That was the thing, she's so coachable. What does coachable mean? It means the ability to solicit, so get in feedback, whether formally or informally, and to determine what part of the feedback you're going to act on and act on it quickly, right? Because once you're coachable, then if you're not performing, something's wrong with the environment because you're taking in the feedback and you're acting on it, right? It can be your superpower. Now, in the Caribbean region, what I've noticed is that we're not a very feedback-oriented culture. And I've worked across a number of countries in the region. We're not really into feedback so much. In fact, one senior leader in Barbados was telling me, who's a friend of mine, I lived there for 2 years and I had a crew of Asian friends who were all kind of leaders in private sector primarily. One guy said to me, no, sir, I don't like to give feedback to women. I said, but why? He said, because they cry. I was just blown away that he said that, and I thought to myself, now imagine how many other people may think that and how much feedback you, the lady, you're not receiving. The best way to perform at your full potential is to ensure that feedback loop is reaching you. I have watched men in both the private sector and the public sector, and I've watched that feedback loop happening more naturally. Now, listen, we don't need to talk about what's fair, what's not fair. We just need to understand our context and say, I'm going to be coachable. That's my superpower. When you are engaged in feedback, though, it's important for it to be action-oriented. It should be kind of periodic, so it almost feels normal and natural. Feedback when someone says, I feel like you are, that's not good feedback. Let them speak, but that's not good feedback because feelings are not really act on feelings. But if they say, I feel like you here's an example, then you know exactly what triggered the feeling as the person receiving the feedback, so you know what to do differently. I think if our countries became much more mature around giving and receiving feedback, not just in the private sector, but in academia, in nonprofit, in the public sector, we would lift our game. I think that's one of the big, powerful potentials to unlock in the region. And women will benefit significantly more because there's so little feedback coming, relatively speaking. Mentoring relationships are important. I call it allyship. You know, it's people who certainly are within your lane, so they do what you do, but also they can be outside of your lane, so they can be more objective if you're thinking of doing something differently, you know, or doing something completely out of the box. But what has been very helpful to me over the decades has actually also been what I call peer mentors. It is okay for people your age, you know, your generation, to mentor you, because maybe they're in another field that you're not in, that you want to learn more about. Maybe they've taken career decisions that you're thinking of taking. That's okay. Mentorship is not about someone has to be far more experienced than you. And a futurist once said at an event I went to that IWF had put on a few years ago in Jamaica, they brought down a futurist, and she said, if you want to be a successful business leader, ensure you have someone on the 18 that is mentoring you. Like, I thought it was very profound. And then I thought, gosh, my kids are still too young, so I can't get that mentorship. But when she really shared it, I started looking around and thinking, even with my own bank, and I said, when you listen to the young people, you get a different perspective. And there's so much rapid change happening that I really value that. The other thing I want to share is that women usually take on what I call challenging roles. When you look at some of, you know, look in organizations and you look at the paths of women leadership, usually getting some real challenging roles. You know, and I think the Citibank CEO, that's the new CEO of Citibank globally, when she came in, she was, you know, shared, it was celebrated that she was the first female CEO. And then they shared there's a huge transformation that's required. It's going to be a tough road. And that's what usually will come our way at times. But guess what? That's fine, because once you get through challenges, it makes you even stronger and better at what you do. And that's why when I'm looking to recruit, I need a diverse team. You know, I need to see that resilience. I need to see people who've been challenged. And so it's okay to take on those challenging roles. Don't look to the side and say, well, he has an easier role than she. Take them on if you feel equipped to do it, because you will learn and grow in the process. Final 2 points, just very quickly. I do believe that positive mindset is critical. It sounds pretty hokey pokey, but the truth is you can look at things, the same set of facts are happening, and how you internalize those facts and what energy you give out really does generate an outcome. And I believe that as women, you know, we manage a lot, and it's most important to have a strong and intentional mindset. You know, I was speaking about 6 years ago at something. I just kind of moved home formally, and I was speaking at the International Women's Day Forum. And I said, picture this, and I'll just share it right now in the last minute that I have. I said, picture this to everybody in the room. It was a women's event. And this is Jamaica. And I said, imagine it's a Friday, and all the women, not even a Friday, let's call it Monday. Imagine it's a Monday, and all the women in Jamaica got on a plane for 3 days and 2 nights. So they've got on the plane Monday, let's give them 3 nights. They come back on a Thursday, right? All the women in Jamaica, every single one, left the country for vacation and came back on a Thursday. What would happen? Well, this is before COVID, by the way. Well, our teachers, schools, most of the teachers are women. So some of the schools would have to take probably a little break. Well, in the households, for those of us who can afford to have helpers, nannies, etc., well, you kind of have to look after your children. And remember now, there are less teachers. Well, who's going to cook the food? Men cook in our culture, but on average, there are more women, right? Who's going to work in those offices? I just told you 60% of middle managers are women, right? And then you start to think about the collective impact that this whole segment of society has. And then we say to ourselves, we really need to focus on ensuring that we remove some of those obstacles to ensure that they're getting to their full potential. Because remember, when they do, the whole country, the whole society, the whole region rises. And so I'll just end there. Thank you very much for accommodating me.
Wow, that was really incredible. So interesting to hear the scope of everything that you've been able to achieve in your life and how you address it. And also the vertical approach that needs to happen, both from the perspective of understanding the situation, which Dr. Svengel was talking about, understanding women's roles, to understanding the progress and evolution of women's rights, and then the practical. How do you apply who you are? How do you take the situation, like you said, you have to understand it and move forward with it. And then you have the Dr. Svangel, talking about, I don't know what happened here, I'm sorry. How then how we discuss it and how we move on evolutionarily. Is that a word? There's so many points that you made in what you just discussed, and I wrote down a lot. I think that everything from educating men and young boys on women's rights, women's issues is very important. The access to capital, I mean, everything. So I want to open up the questions first from our group, and again, like I said, you can put them in the Q&A box. So here I have a first question from Jennifer Nugent Hill, and it is for Miss McIntosh Robinson. The pandemic pulled the cover off the importance of the supply chain and logistics sector. What is the appetite for Caribbean bankers to finance women-owned businesses in this sector? So I want to hear from you on this, but I also want you to add to that how, yes, the pandemic did expose all of that, but it also, I think, it exposed the fact that women who are working out of the home now, as you said earlier, because their nannies, their housekeepers could not be at home with them. So how are they able to address? And the women who have to be the nannies and also raise their own kids and also have their own jobs. So I think if possible, maybe you could answer.
Yes, yeah, definitely. So let me talk about the banks. I'm happy to share about where the banking industry is going. Certainly at First Global Bank where I work, we have products that are designed for women. Scotiabank in Jamaica just launched their women's initiative, and we're the first market outside of Canada, which is their headquarters region, where they launched an initiative. JMB, I mean, there are a number of banks in the local banking sector that is focused on products geared towards women. But what's driving this? I mean, apart from just our own personal interest to see removing that obstacle of access to capital, the global community is recognizing the importance of women leadership and how that impacts the growth in economies. And so a lot of our funding sources, when you look for specific lines of capital focused on SMEs, there's always a mandate around how do you target women. And so that's good that the development organizations, the global funding organizations are pushing that mandate. So that helps. So that's number one. But secondly, specifically within, just to answer Ms. Nugent's question, we have products that are so specific from, if you're a woman-led business, so a woman is leading the business, that woman has a baby and goes on maternity leave for 3 months. And, I think the region is doing really well with their maternity policy. But anyway, if she goes on maternity leave for 3 months, we give you a moratorium. So we bake in that you don't need to pay back anything for those 3 months. And after the 3 months now, you regularize payments. I mean, that is just so targeted and specific to understand the context of how women operate. And certainly if you're running a business, there's a lot more pressure than if you're just a team member on a large team within a corporation. There are other banks who are funding initiatives like fertility treatments. You can get a specific loan if you are trying to have a baby, and that's actually not our bank, but it's another bank within the Jamaican context. But I wanted to just give tangible examples of how there's a focus on women. We started our recent campaign last year. And so when you're applying to banks within the region in the Caribbean, you should know that there is an appetite, in fact, a focus to really figure out how we can empower women to move forward and to really get rid of that big obstacle around access to capital. As it relates to the home work-life balance, one of the things we realized in 2020 because I thought this pandemic, truth be told, in March 2020, when it was named a global pandemic, I thought, okay, let's just get to the summer and then we'll be done with this thing. I really thought so. Like, it didn't occur to me that we'd be still in this mode till sometime last year, kind of sunk in. And so one of the things I said is we have to really prioritize how we ensure people to work flexibly, because The moment people are weighed down by trying to juggle, but they feel like they can't speak about it, you don't really get the best results at work. So we had people with kids who would photobomb, or whatever the word is when you're on Zoom, you Zoom bomb the call, and I would say it's okay to say, hi, so-and-so, just make it normal and then keep it moving. We had talked about that at the executive committee level of Grace Kennedy, and then in meetings that has happened, and up to our group CEO level, we just say hi to the child, and that's the family orientation, that culture that you create that you wouldn't have contemplated before COVID, because no child is coming into a real meeting in person, you know, for work. Those little things that you do help to reinforce the culture. Culture is the reinforcement of a desired set of behaviors. And so that's been helpful. The other thing we did though is we actually encouraged our team members to speak up. What I noticed in the pandemic is the younger persons had more anxiety than the older people, which is interesting because we always think as older people, we are going to suffer more. And our young people are resilient, but the young persons, I saw it very quickly. I work with 70% of the bank are where I work, millennials, and I love working with young people. And I start to realize that we need to have much more communication. We need to give access to psychologists, run sessions so that people feel confident, they feel pumped up, they're reminded of what matters, and they're reminded of the support structure that they have. So that's one of the things that we had to do, which is not about capital, as much as it's about communication and policies that we put in place. I think COVID has been a remarkable shift, a remarkable kind of disruption in society. And while it's created some inequality on a very immediate, tangible level, I think it's forced a lot of us to look at where are we trying to go, and how do we get through this very uncomfortable period where you see even more divisions at times across the world to really move the world to where we're trying to go on a number of levels, not just gender, but climate change and other things. But I'll just stop there.
So thank you for that answer. I think what you just described was what you talked about earlier with the unexpected leader. How many women and people were able to either embrace the new situation with COVID and rise, or who had a difficult time, which thank you for answering that. I think President Solis, did you have a question? Did you want to ask?
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to ask Dr. Zwingel to elaborate a bit more about the debate on nation building and political structures in the Caribbean, particularly coming from the feminist movement. Because what we are seeing now, the revamping of republicanism and the possibility of other nations following Barbados's example is something that has precedence. But I would like her to explain to us how important, how significant that has been in what she has studied as part of that debate. I know it is part of the North-South discussions, was an issue in the North-South discussions in the 70s. But what else, what other elements can we see there, and how women leadership has impacted in that area? Thank you.
I'm sorry, I had a hard time unmuting myself still. Okay, thank you for that question. Piggybacking a little bit on what I said before, I mean, I really think that this idea in the Anglophone Caribbean of the post-colonial development state was very much one about lifting up the entire population and really sort of being also a project in which women were very, very important and should also benefit from, right? And Ms. McIntosh Robinson also talked about the high level of women being part in higher education in the Caribbean. I think it's a very, very important feature of that, this opening of a state project that is there for its people, right? And what I find interesting, so and I referenced Eugene Barito's work, who said who describes this development project as gendered in the sense that women were integrated in a subordinate position, so not really thought of as the topmost leaders, right? And again, you heard that in economics, we have a similar dynamic, and I think it's actually true beyond the Caribbean, that it's very accepted to have people be, it's very accepted to have women be part of middle management or be sort of part of an effort economically, politically, if you think of a political party, for example, to be part of an effort on the middle level, lower level, middle level, but then it comes to the higher level, it becomes a little bit more exceptional, right? And I find the Caribbean, by the way, very interesting in this regard, because you do have very strong female leader at the very top. You do have that, right? We were talking about Mia Motley before, and there are several others that could be named. But you also have, I think it's interesting, you have women actually underrepresented in political parties. And I think this has a lot to do with this cultural idea of, women can be party members, but if they rise too high, then I think they actually encounter a lot of cultural obstacles, gender stereotypes and things like that in the Caribbean, and this is true for other countries also. But I have to say, for the level of women being empowered in the Caribbean on many levels, social, economic, and so forth, and always being such a strong player in the community, economically, socially, culturally, and so forth, I think women are extremely underrepresented politically in the Caribbean. So I think that's a puzzle to address. Again, I think this is changing. I think this assumption of the unexpected leadership comes into play here as well. I think this is a very, very good term, right? Which also, I think, points us to the fact that there is expected leadership that somehow we have culturally come to expect over many, many times. And not only in the Caribbean, I mean, it's a very European thing, right? I mean, certainly, like, for example, in the mid-20th century, I mean, the expectations from Europe were much more patriarchal than the reality in the Caribbean, actually. But, it was imposed, it was coming from the colonial center or ex-colonial center. So, I think I really like this term that this McIntosh coined, this unexpected leadership that is developing here. But I also wonder, and I don't have good answers for that, unfortunately, what it is that allows this unexpected leadership to flourish. What are the conditions, right? And I think maybe one that I heard from what you said and what I also found in my work is it's networking. I mean, you cannot do this by yourself. You cannot do this as an individual riser. I mean, maybe this works sometimes, but usually you need, because you work against the odds, you work against the expectations, right? You need to build up strength in forms of networks of whatever kind, right? This could be within a party, this could be a union, this could be in a mentoring network, all those things. And I think that's an ongoing need and an ongoing project. That's what I would have to say.
Thank you for that answer. I think that the access to networking that you mentioned is very important. You have these sort of NGOs and banks that invest in micro lending, the trend that was moving out of up until the millennium and in the early 2000s. So for these sort of micro lending and small banks to now, how do you move women from middle management up into upper management? So I think that there are these two approaches that that scholars take and that executives take when they're doing these examinations of how to benefit the community better. So I think that networking is really important, because when you're on a micro lending level, you're working with everyone in the community. But as you're moving forward through the bank, it's a very individualized, it is my business, it is my, so I think that these groups and organizations of women, it's important to not only talk amongst the women, but it's how do you get out into the community and into these higher levels. And then again, as we opened up the discussion with, was how do you then get after these commitments to be implemented? How do you hold people responsible? How do you hold nations responsible? How do you hold banks responsible? Organizations, So I'd like to hear from both of you on how anything that I just brought up, and how do you hold people responsible? Is it the responsibility of the individual, or how do we discuss this in conferences, et cetera?
Okay, well, I could start on that. So I do think there's a role for commitments. It's a very controversial thing. And let me just start by saying, I think the fact that FIU is facilitating this dialogue on women empowerment in the Caribbean region is in and of itself very groundbreaking. I know you probably have done this before, but what I've found is that people are not, especially of a particular generation, they're not comfortable talking about women and women's issues in the Caribbean. So they're not used to saying, I'm in a women affinity group. They say, I am a executive. I don't know what you're talking about, Mariame. Now, having lived in the United States and seen the value of various affinity groups, and the affinity groups do well, not because of their networking with each other, exactly what you're saying, Ms. Green. They're doing well because there's so many people in mainstream who are pulling for them. And mainstream is comfortable with having those affinity groups because they help to understand and unpack things even within the group. And they help to explain what their needs are. And they help to reinforce development and pushing them through the firm to do well. So the US, with all its issues, actually has a very well-oiled machine with how to deal with differences and to celebrate differences and to talk about it. But it's never comfortable. The Caribbean, I think, is behind the US on this. When you talk about women's issues, it's like it's parked to the side, and people will say, that's not relevant to me. I'm at my firm and I'm just doing well because I'm me. I actually think it's important to have the dialogue, not to say I want special treatment. It's more to unpack things. And this thing about the unexpected leader, I've seen it, I've lived it. Let me give you an example. I have this thing called tea time, right? Which is a thing we implemented some years ago, where anyone in the firm can set up 30 minutes with me to talk about anything on their mind. So everybody knows, and they usually come in and share what they think could be improved or what they're feeling or thinking. I'm just astonished at how when women come into my office, they talk about the fact that they want to be cross-trained, they're thinking about what next, they want to be lateral. The guys who come into my office, and there are many levels, they come in and they're like, Mariame, I want to get to the next level. What advice you have for me? That's how they think. And I started to notice the pattern, not because I was looking for it, it's because I was shocked, because I would be in these meetings with some very high-performing women, young women, and I'll just be asking questions. Well, if you're in credit, why you want to go and training treasury? Why don't you think about getting to that next level of, say, manager? What are your thoughts there? And I said, well, I don't know if I'm ready. I figure if I know more about banking, then I could get to the next level. Then I deserve the next level of leadership. I'm more likely to be successful. So there really is this difference in the psyche of how a woman shows up in the workplace. And that's where the affinity groups and these conversations matter. But what I found is that the generation at the top, so to speak, as we move through, they're not, I think because they were so groundbreaking when they were younger coming through, right? 2 decades ago or so, it wasn't spoken about. So as they've gotten through and been successful. So they're not used to that conversation, and it's not mainstream. Talking about women's issues, not mainstream. It's become more mainstream, but it's generally not. So I thank you for having this forum. And what I will say is the younger people coming behind us, this is part of the course for them because they've grown up in the information age. So whether you went to school abroad or not, you have friends on Instagram and TikTok, and they just have so much information. And so they're going to demand talking about things. And I think that's good for the world and it's good for the region. So I do think the networking and the affinity group and having these conversations and not shying away from it and really talking about what success looks like is very important. Last thing I'll just say, unexpected leader. My biggest thing on the unexpected leader, which I thought about while being at First Global Bank, right? This whole concept and watching people and watching my own growth is that it's actually great to be an unexpected leader. Why? You don't have a lot of room to underperform, right? Like if people talk about you, people get rid of you, people say, I don't like you, and you won't stay in your role for long. You just simply won't, right? And so what happens is as the unexpected leader, you learn to be a fundamentally better leader, as all leaders should be learning when you're in these leadership roles. And what I might face that says, wait, I need to have had that discussion differently. I should have been more explicit. I should have set the vision. An expected leader could get away with not doing that and they'd be just fine. But it's still good for them to have had that experience as well, because all leaders need to grow. So actually there's a huge benefit, I think, to facing these headwinds. Because the headwinds may seem personal, but if you are a better leader, you deal with them better. So being an unexpected leader actually forces you to move quite quickly up the leadership chain, even if you're not getting it in positional power. Thanks.
Thank you. I find it interesting that you set up tea time for these discussions. It's very different than the sort of the male gaze of tea time, which is on the golf course, where they make deals. So I like that. So I know, Dr. Lewis, you had a question, and then I know we have a question from Dr. Solis. Maybe we could, we have 10 minutes, so maybe we can propose these two questions and then go ahead.
Thank you, Kimberly. I just had a quick question for Ms. McIntosh Robinson, particularly your background. We all know Grace Kennedy really as a regional and multinational company, 100 years old, but really initially in food and beverage. And I'm curious, is there anything you can share with us, particularly with this focus on women's management, access to capital and so on that shift from this company that was basically feeding us for so many decades and now is financing us in many areas, and how that took place? Obviously, that could be a whole webinar, but we know a lot of that leadership generationally from Grace Kennedy, but I think it's a wonderful corporate transformation, not just for Jamaica, but the region as a whole. So anything you could shed on that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. Thank you for that question. We are 100 years old today. We're older than Jamaica is independent. And one of the things I just shared, so Grace Kennedy has its roots in food manufacturing and distribution, and we still do that today. But we're also sort of two focuses, that's one, and the second is financial services. And so we have banking, remittances, insurance, investments, etc. What has been constant over the 100 years, and I've had family members work at Grace Kennedy who are in the next generation above me, and I've seen it kind of as a young child observing, is really the values. And so a company that is very grounded in values, and you find ways to keep instilling that and discussing that with your team members, right? Honesty, integrity, and trust. And there are a few more added, but those three are always there. It helps you to predict how you will deal with difficult situations, how you'll treat your staff, how you'll treat customers, etc. So that has been critical. But Grace Kennedy and certainly at First Global Bank, we've been very focused on where the world is going around inclusion. You know, this idea of growth, inclusive growth. If Jamaica is going to do well, we need to bring everyone along. Grace Kennedy has a history of working with SMEs, suppliers, merchandisers, truckers. I mean, we've worked with many, many spheres of society. And so we're always constantly thinking about how do you support those different stakeholders, because what's good for our company is good for Jamaica, what's good for Jamaica is good for our company, right? There's a real linkage there. As it relates to leadership, I want to speak about this because, again, I take these things for granted, and I'm extremely appreciative of those who come before me, because what I experience now is totally different than 20 years ago. There are many leaders in the Grace Kennedy Group who are senior, they're general managers, CEOs of their SBUs, our divisional head. 2 of our 3 divisions are led by women, right? And these are women who have come up and done well. They're not just there as a token. And so, you know, they may not be always, not all are public, but the diversity of leadership at Grace Kennedy has evolved, and it has to really hand it to our group CEO, Don Webby, who has encouraged that, right? And, you know, I was meeting with a customer, a global customer came into Jamaica to meet with us at the bank, and there are a number of female leaders at the bank. We do have a pretty balanced leadership team. And they were just like, wow, you know, we're not used to seeing female bank CEOs. But now, since I joined the banking sector, half of the CEOs of the 8 banks are women. And so I just think the more you see more of this happening, it becomes less of a talking point, and the younger persons coming up believe that there are the multiple paths and they can get on one of those paths. So it really is a privilege to be a part of the group that's leading the way, and people do watch what Grace Kennedy does. So thank you.
Thank you so much for your answers. I think also what you're showing is how important the work that Dr. Svengel does in the study of this journey on what roads were able to be built in order to get to where you are. And I know that President Solis, you have a question for Dr. Svengel about post-colonial Caribbean.
No, actually, that had to do with her previous commentary, which I appreciated a lot. You know, I think it's fantastic to further the study of the specific sectors of Caribbean, of the economy, on finances and politics, etc., where women have played a role. I was thinking the other day regarding the question of the election of a woman president in Honduras, which just happened at the end of last year. In Latin America, in Latin America, the continent, that is, and in Spanish-speaking Latin America, I don't think we've had so many presidents and heads of government that have been women as in the Caribbean. I mean, I think that there are many more in the Caribbean through the years. I remember Virginia Charles, of course, which was probably one of the most notable in the 1980s. But I suppose that this was also the case before. David, I don't know if you can recall if there were more before her, but since her, I've seen a good number of women in politics as well. And I think Suzanne is going to have a ball in getting, her studies going for the Fulbright during her Fulbright tenure, because she's going to find a tremendous amount of human material there. No, but those were my 2 cents. David, I don't know if you have that, and then I guess we'll have to close. But I wish we could stay for longer.
Dr. Lewis, you have no more comments?
No, I'm good. Obviously, there's Dame Miss Charles was really the path breaker on that front, and subsequent to that, of course, we've had Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados. I mean, it's just been growing. But I think the key point is that middle level in politics is still that's where the break-in is still pending. And particularly in the structures of political parties, which haven't progressed as much in that inclusivity. I think that's where the challenge is, and that's where we're meeting a lot of that inclusivity issue in terms of traditional politics in many of the islands in the Caribbean. Interestingly enough, for example, a very dynamic and inclusive economy like the Dominican Republic, we still have not even had a major woman presidential candidate, much less be elected. So there's some nuances there that still have to be worked out.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, thank you to everyone. I don't know if is our time up?
Yes, almost there, a couple of minutes, but that's fine. We can close it. You go ahead, Kimberly. Thank you.
Well, I wanted to just see if Dr. Zwingel, if you wanted to make any comments. I wanted to congratulate you again on the work that you're doing and how exciting moving forward. We really look forward to seeing what you're able to accomplish with this. And I just, as an FIU professor, I'm just so happy that you're here and you're able to bring people together the way that you are with this. Especially Doctor, you might as well be a doctor, McIntosh Robinson. So Dr. Zwengel, do you have any closing comments you wanted to make? I hope I'm pronouncing your name right.
Perfect. No, thank you so much. And I mean, just going back to your very initial, most important question of the follow-up of commitments, right? And who needs to make the commitments and who should be held accountable. And I think we cannot let the states off the hook. States do not fix everything, but they create frameworks. And I think also the multilateral spaces like the UN is very, very important to, pull in. And as you mentioned, I mean, the Sustainable Development Goals, that's a plan to make this earth inhabitable well for everybody, right? And that has a very strong gender dimension that brings in, ecological sustainability and brings all those things together. And this is, I think, where we have to go forward to leave nobody behind, right? It's also, I mean, gender is not only about women, it's about everybody living a good life, right? And I think that's the important path forward. But thanks for your kind words. Thank you.
You're muted, Kimberly. You're muted.
I'm sorry. Thank you. I'm so excited to see where everybody goes from here. And just thank you so much for being a part of the Latin American Caribbean Studies program at FIU. And President Solis and Dr. Lewis, thank you for bringing everyone together. I appreciate this. And thank you, Lindsay Dudley, for putting it together as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Have a great week. Thank you, everybody.
Everybody too. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much.